If you want to know when the middle class gets wounded, do not begin with the stock market. Begin at the pump. Begin with the truck stop. Begin with the cargo ship. Begin with the fertilizer bill. Begin with the airline fuel hedge. Begin with the delivery van that suddenly costs more to run, the grocery order that suddenly costs more to stock, and the family budget that suddenly has less room to breathe. I have spent my life watching money move through systems, and one lesson has remained brutally consistent. When oil makes a violent move, it does not stay in the oil market. It walks into every aisle of the economy wearing a different disguise. It shows up as expensive groceries. It shows up as thinner business margins. It shows up as canceled vacations, delayed hiring, weaker confidence, tighter credit, and a household that thought it was safe until it realizes every ordinary expense is being quietly repriced against it. That is why I do not treat an oil shock as a commodity story. I treat it as a pressure story, and the danger to the middle class is not simply that energy gets expensive. The real danger comes when two forms of pressure arrive at the same time. One pressure attacks the cost of living. The other pressure attacks the stability of income. When those two pressures meet, families do not feel a headline. They feel a squeeze, a real squeeze. The kind that forces behavior to change before official data admits anything is wrong. That is the pattern I want you to see. History never repeats with perfect manners, but it does repeat with familiar damage. The oil shocks of 1973, 1979, 1990, and 2008 did not hurt because people suddenly became irrational. They hurt because energy is an input underneath almost everything modern life depends on. Raise the price of the base input, and the entire structure above it begins to groan. Sometimes that groan becomes a slowdown, sometimes it becomes a recession, sometimes it becomes a transfer of wealth from the unprepared to the patient. And now I look at 2026 and I see something even more dangerous than a simple rerun of an old energy script. I see oil pressure arriving while the labor market is already being reorganized by artificial intelligence. That is the part most people miss. In many periods, families can survive higher costs if income remains secure. In other periods, they can survive job anxiety if prices remain manageable. But when living costs rise while entry, level and routine work are being aggressively questioned by employers, the middle class loses its shock absorbers. That is how a squeeze becomes a social event. The first mechanism is what I call the energy tax. Governments do not need to pass a law for this tax to appear. No congressman needs to vote on it. No one needs to announce it from a podium. The tax simply enters through prices. Oil goes up, and life becomes more expensive in 100 places at once. You see it in gasoline, of course. That part is obvious, but the pump is only the front door. Diesel matters, freight matters, packaging matters, industrial production matters, farming matters, fertilizer matters, heating matters, air travel matters. Every business that relies on movement, refrigeration, plastic, transport, chemicals, scheduling, warehousing, or logistics suddenly finds that its operating assumptions are no longer true. The middle class does not experience this as a theory. It experiences it as arithmetic. A household that was already stretched now discovers that the same paycheck purchases less food, less transportation, less leisure, and less margin for error. The family that used to feel stable because it could cover the mortgage and the car payment suddenly notices that it was never wealthy. It was only solvent under a cheaper energy regime. That distinction matters. A lot of people think inflation is an abstract macroeconomic term designed for economists and television panels. It is not. Inflation is simply the process by which your previous life stops fitting inside your current income. Oil shocks accelerate that process because they do not merely raise one discretionary expense. They lean on the entire chain. Think of a family with $100 of weekly free cash flow after fixed expenses. If fuel rises, food rises, utilities rise, and insurance pressure follows broader cost stress. That $100 can disappear without a single dramatic event. Nobody had to lose a job yet. Nobody had to miss a mortgage payment yet. The family simply has less room. It starts buying less. It postpones repairs. It delays a purchase. It abandons a trip. It says no more often. That is not just personal pain. That is macroeconomic transmission, because your reduced spending becomes someone else's reduced revenue. That brings me to the second mechanism, what I call the spending fracture. The economy is not powered by confidence alone, but confidence is the permission slip for spending. Most people do not buy cars, move houses, renovate kitchens, or splurge on discretionary purchases merely because they technically can. They do those things because they feel safe enough to imagine tomorrow. Oil shocks attack that imagination. When people believe the next 6 months are getting more expensive, they become cautious. When they become cautious, demand softens. When demand softens, businesses discover that higher input costs are arriving at exactly the wrong time. Their own expenses rise while their customers hesitate. Margins get hit from both sides. That is the fracture. Costs are climbing, revenue growth is wobbling. Business owners start asking smaller, uglier questions. Do we hire? Do we expand? Do we cut? Do we freeze? Do we replace this person with software? Do we postpone that project? Do we stop taking risk? That is how an oil story walks into a boardroom and comes out wearing the mask of employment caution during stable times. A business can often survive higher costs by passing some of them on. But when households are already squeezed and demand is softening, price increases become harder to push through. So companies start hunting elsewhere for relief. They cut marketing, they cut travel, they cut contractors, they cut hiring, then they cut people. And now in 2026, that cycle is colliding with the third mechanism, what I call the labor split. I want to be very precise here. AI is not simply eliminating all work. That is lazy thinking. What it is doing is forcing companies to redraw the line between valuable human labor and replaceable human labor. Routine computer work, repetitive research, basic drafting, process, heavy support roles, low judgment administrative tasks, simple coding, standard customer interactions, early career white-collar chores. These areas are all under pressure, not because companies hate workers, but because management is always looking for leverage. The average family does not need all jobs to disappear for the damage to begin. It only needs employers to become more selective, more demanding and less forgiving at the exact moment. Household budgets lose flexibility. That is why I say the middle class is vulnerable to a double squeeze. Oil weakens the purchasing power of wages. AI weakens the bargaining power of labor. When both happen together, the old middle class promise starts to break. Work hard, keep your head down, and ordinary life will stay affordable. That promise depends on two conditions. First, that your wages remain reasonably durable. Second, that the baseline cost of life does not run away from you. Once both conditions are in question, a family that looked responsible on paper can suddenly feel fragile in practice. The fourth mechanism is what I call the confidence crack. Consumer sentiment sounds soft. It is not soft. It is behavioral fuel. If a household thinks the future is reasonably secure, it will keep consuming, borrowing, planning, and investing in its own life. If that household starts to worry about job security, inflation, or financial instability, it begins to retreat. Not all at once. Quietly, it stops acting like a participant in expansion and starts acting like a defender in retreat. That shift matters because modern economies are heavily dependent on ordinary people continuing to believe tomorrow will be manageable. When confidence cracks, people become reluctant to commit. Fewer big purchases, fewer moves, fewer financed upgrades, fewer business startups, fewer risks. That hesitation spreads through retail, housing, travel, consumer services, autos, lending, and employment. The slowdown does not start with a giant collapse. It starts with millions of small acts of caution. That is why official recession declarations often arrive long after families already know something is wrong. The people waiting for economists to confirm a recession are usually late. GDP is a lagging scoreboard. Households live inside the game before the scoreboard updates. By the time 2/4 of shrinking output are officially stamped and discussed, balance sheets have already been damaged, confidence has already been wounded, and asset prices may have already moved. I learned a long time ago that rich people and poor people often inhabit the same economy very differently. During stress, the wealthy can delay decisions and preserve options. The middle class often cannot. It is committed to fixed costs, mortgage, rent, tuition, childcare, insurance, transportation, groceries, debt service. The poor suffer first, and brutally, the wealthy adapt with inconvenience. The middle class gets squeezed in the middle because it has enough obligations to feel trapped and not enough flexibility to feel protected. That is why oil shocks can wipe out the middle class without literally wiping it out. They do not always produce mass visible collapse. They produce exhaustion, depleted savings, delayed life plans, smaller ambitions, more leverage, more fear, a population that begins mistaking survival for progress. Now I want to go one level deeper, because understanding the damage is only half the job. The other half is understanding what this means for capital. The stock market is not the economy. I have said versions of that my entire adult life. Markets move on expectations, liquidity, narrative, positioning rates, and psychology. Good news can be sold, bad news can be bought. A recession can begin after a rally. A recovery can start before the headlines improve. So if you wait for the world to feel safe, you will often pay a premium for that safety. But that does not mean you should become reckless. It means you need a framework. During a squeeze period, I divide the world into three categories. There are assets that are simply being hit because everything is emotional. There are assets that are structurally helped by the new environment, and there are assets that look cheap but are actually being repriced. For good reason, most amateurs do not separate those three. They buy whatever fell the most. That is not investing. That is emotional bargain hunting. What I care about is whether the earning power, necessity, or strategic value of the thing I am buying is likely to be stronger on the other side of the panic. If you believe the American economy will be larger in 10 years, then broad productive assets bought during episodes of fear are usually a good place to begin. I have always favored simple, durable exposure over frantic complexity. Owning a wide slice of productive enterprise remains one of the soundest paths for ordinary people. Broad index exposure, quality dividend growers, essential consumer businesses, these are not thrilling cocktail, party ideas. They are the compounding engines that keep working while the crowd searches for drama. I have no problem with a disciplined accumulation program. Buy regularly. Automate it. Keep buying when people are cheerful. Keep buying when they are frightened. Keep buying when television makes the future sound uninvestable. A broad market vehicle, a strong dividend strategy, a defensive staple sleeve, those things are not magic, but they are honest. They let you participate in long-term economic expansion without pretending you can forecast every quarter. That is one side of the blueprint. The other side is opportunistic. But narrower, if oil remains elevated for longer than expected, there are sectors that benefit from the stress energy producers and related cash flow machines can do very well in a world that hates high fuel prices. That does not mean they are always a buy. It means the logic is real. If the world must keep paying more for energy, someone is receiving that payment. The same goes for selected hedges. Gold is not, in my mind, a productive business. It does not wake up and earn more because management improved operations, but it can serve a role when people are frightened by inflation, currency debasement, war, or systemic stress. They often reach for a store of perceived value. I do not worship it. I do not build my life around it. But I understand why a measured allocation can calm a portfolio exposed to monetary fear. Then there are the future, facing beneficiaries of labor and capital reorganization. If AI keeps advancing, and I think it will, then the infrastructure beneath AI matters. Semiconductors matter. Selected software enablers matter. Compute matters. Power matters. Certain automation layers matter. When fear forces indiscriminate selling, you can sometimes buy tomorrow's necessities at prices offered only because today's mood is miserable. But this is where discipline separates investors from spectators. You cannot buy every exciting story. You need a hierarchy. My hierarchy under a squeeze regime is simple. First, protect the household engine. Second, preserve buying power. Third, accumulate productive assets. Fourth, take selective exposure to the bottlenecks and beneficiaries created by the new regime. That order matters. Too many people reverse it. They speculate while fragile. They chase upside while one emergency away from liquidation. Then the market gives them an opportunity and they cannot take it because they built no resilience. The middle-class family that wants to survive and then benefit from a period like this needs an operating system, not a slogan. Here is the operating system I would use. First, assume official reassurance will arrive later than personal pain. Do not build your budget around optimistic policy guesses. If lower oil prices come quickly, good. If rates get cut sooner than expected, good. But do not rely on rescue. Build around what is true. Now, not what someone on television promises might happen. Second, treat every recurring expense as guilty until proven useful. Squeeze periods are won by cash flow discipline. If money is getting tighter and income, durability is less certain, then every unnecessary drag on monthly life should be interrogated. People hate this advice because it feels small. It is not small. Survival in a squeeze is arithmetic. The household that keeps margin keeps options. The household that loses margin loses negotiating power with life. Third, build a real reserve, not a symbolic reserve, not a hope fund. I mean liquid cash that exists to absorb shocks. The emergency fund is not there for vacations, cars, or symbolic comfort. It is there because the family with liquidity can endure a job wobble, a medical event, a repair, or a temporary slowdown without becoming a forced seller. Forced sellers get butchered in every cycle. Fourth, audit your labor value. This may be the most neglected instruction in modern personal finance. If AI is redrawing the labor map, you must ask which side of the line you live on. Are you doing repeatable output or judgment, rich output? Are you managing systems or being replaced by systems? Are you learning how to use the new tools to amplify your value? Or are you waiting for your employer to tell you what changed after it is too late? The household cannot think only like a consumer anymore. It must think like an enterprise protecting its revenue line. Fifth, keep buying productive assets if your time horizon is long and your balance sheet is sound. I do not care whether the crowd is euphoric or terrified. If you have margin, no toxic debt problem, and a horizon measured in years, then regular accumulation remains one of the most rational things you can do. Panic is expensive for sellers and wonderful for buyers. With discipline. 6, do not confuse a house with a retirement plan. A paid-off home can reduce future living costs, and that matters. But unless the property is producing income or you are willing to monetize it, a house is primarily shelter, not freedom. The middle class gets into trouble when it counts the same asset twice, once as a place to live, and again as if it were a liquid wealth machine. That illusion becomes dangerous in stress periods. 7th, distinguish between hedges and compounding machines. Gold can hedge fear, energy can hedge scarcity, staples can hedge recessionary behavior, broad equities can compound national productivity, dividend growers can compound and throw off cash. Semiconductors and infrastructure can benefit from structural capital flows. Each one serves a different role. Put them in the wrong role and you will hate them at the wrong time. Now let me speak directly to the identity flip, because this is where a lot of families either level up or get trapped. Most people move through periods like this as wage dependents. They ask one question over and over. What is this going to do to me? That is the wrong identity. I would rather you become an asset allocator, even if your starting capital is modest. An asset allocator asks different questions. Which pressures are temporary? Which pressures are structural? Which businesses get paid when fear rises? Which assets get repriced because the crowd cannot tolerate uncertainty? Which opportunities are being created because everyone is staring at the obvious headline and missing the deeper transmission? That is a different way to live. You do not need millions to think this way. You need discipline. You need emotional control. You need the ability to stop worshiping price stability and start understanding value under stress. The middle class gets wiped out not merely because prices go up. It gets wiped out because it remains a pure consumer in a world that rewards owners. If you only buy consumption, rising prices punish you. If you also buy assets tied to productive capacity, scarcity, energy, infrastructure, or enterprise, then at least part of the world that is hurting you is also paying you. That is not cynicism, that is self-defense. When I hear people say they are waiting for certainty, I hear someone volunteering to pay more. Later markets do not hand out easy entry points wrapped in emotional comfort. Usually they give you the chance to act precisely when the future looks messy and people around you want relief more than reason. I am not telling you to become reckless. I am telling you to stop confusing calm headlines with low risk and scary headlines with high risk. Sometimes the calmest period is when risk is being built. Sometimes the ugliest period is when opportunity is being offered. The question is whether you have the temperament to tell the difference. Let me put the 2026 situation in plain English. If the Middle East conflict settles quickly and oil pressure fades, some of this squeeze may ease faster than people expect. Confidence can recover, spending can improve. The labor shock from AI will still be real, but the economy may absorb it with less broad damage. In that world, the panic may prove temporary and broad accumulation during fear may look brilliant in hindsight. If the conflict drags on and oil remains high, then the energy tax deepens, confidence weakens further, spending softens, corporate caution spreads, the labor split becomes harsher, some sectors crack, defensive assets and selective scarcity beneficiaries likely keep outperforming, while broad risk appetite becomes less forgiving. I do not pretend to know the exact timing. Anybody who tells you they know exactly how this sequence plays out is selling you comfort. Not truth, but I do know this: your job is not to forecast with perfect precision. Your job is to build a life and a portfolio that can survive the squeeze and exploit the repricing. That is the contract. And there is one final point I want to make because it is the one people resist the most. A recession, if it comes, will not be your enemy by default. That sentence upsets people because recessions are painful and they are unfair. They hurt workers, families, and small businesses. They damage confidence and they expose bad balance sheets brutally. All of that is true. But a recession also reveals price. It strips fantasy from assets. It forces leverage to unwind. It allows disciplined buyers to purchase streams of future cash flow at better terms than optimism ever permits. More fortunes are built from patient buying during ugly periods than from enthusiastic buying during pretty ones. So the real decision in front of you is not whether 2026 feels comfortable. It is whether you will live as a squeeze participant or as a prepared owner. One path is familiar. You keep your costs bloated, your savings thin, your skills static, your emotions headline driven, and your investments reactive. In that life, every oil spike feels like an attack because you are exposed only on the consumer side. Every labor shift feels like a threat because your income engine is fragile. Every market decline feels like danger because you have no reserve and no framework. You spend the next few years defending yesterday's lifestyle and calling that prudence. The other path is harder at first and far kinder later. You shrink what does not matter. You protect liquidity. You upgrade your judgment and your usefulness. You accumulate real assets. You stop treating the market like a mood machine and start treating it like a transfer mechanism between the emotional and the disciplined. You become harder to squeeze because your life is no longer built on one paycheck, one narrative, one assumption, or one source of confidence. That is the threshold. You can keep living as though low energy costs, stable jobs, cheap money, and easy assumptions will always return in time to save you. Or you can accept that the world has become more conditional, more strategic, and less forgiving, and build accordingly. One future asks you to hope, the other asks you to think. If I were sitting across from my younger self, I would ask only one question. When the next decade is over, do you want to say the oil shock happened to you? Or do you want to say it taught you to become an owner while everyone else was still trying to become comfortable again? That is not a rhetorical question. That is the mirror. And the answer you give now will decide whether this squeeze becomes your excuse or your turning point.